The first time I realized my marriage was truly over wasn't when I found the hotel receipts. It wasn't even when I caught him texting another woman at 2 a.m. while I lay awake with pregnancy insomnia. No, the moment that shattered everything hit me like a physical blow when I looked up from our daughter's tiny white casket and saw him. Ethan, my husband of 6 years, walking into St. Augustine's chapel hand in hand with her. With Marissa Lane, the woman whose perfume I'd been smelling on his shirts for months. They walked down the center aisle like it was their wedding day, not our baby's funeral. She wore a black dress that cost more than most people's rent, designer heels clicking against the stone floor with each confident step. Her auburn hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless. She looked like she was attending a gallery opening, not saying goodbye to a child who would never take her first breath. The room went silent. 37 people turned to stare, their faces a mixture of shock, disgust, and pity. Pity for me, the grieving mother whose husband had brought his mistress to their daughter's funeral. I didn't scream. I didn't collapse. I couldn't move at all. I just sat there in the front pew, clutching the program with Sophia Grace Donovan's name printed in delicate script, watching my world implode in slow motion. Ethan had the audacity to look surprised by the reaction. He actually seemed confused that people were staring, that his own mother had covered her mouth in horror, that my father was already rising from his seat with murder in his eyes. But Marissa, she smiled. A small, satisfied smile that said she knew exactly what she was doing. That smile told me everything. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't poor judgment or grief-induced confusion. This was calculated. This was her marking territory over a grave that was still being dug. I forced myself to look away, to focus on the tiny casket draped in white roses. Inside was the daughter I'd carried for 8 months, the baby girl who'd kicked against my ribs during late-night movies, who'd hiccuped in my womb when I drank cold water. The child Ethan had claimed to want as much as I did. The same man who was now squeezing another woman's hand while our daughter lay in a box the size of a showbox. I should have felt rage. I should have screamed until my throat was raw. Instead, I felt something colder, sharper. Clarity. Because while Ethan thought he was flaunting his freedom, while Marissa thought she was claiming her prize, they had no idea what they'd just handed me. They'd given me permission to stop protecting him, stop covering for him, stop pretending our marriage was salvageable. They'd given me permission to remember exactly who held the power in this relationship. And it wasn't the man who'd just humiliated me in front of everyone I loved. 3 years ago, when Ethan's import business collapsed spectacularly, he'd begged me to take over our finances. His credit was destroyed, his business accounts frozen by creditors. Everything we owned needed to be transferred to my name to protect it from bankruptcy proceedings. Just temporarily, he'd promised, running his hands through his hair in that defeated way that used to make my heart ache for him. Until I get back on my feet. You're better with money anyway, Claire. You always have been. I was better with money. I was better with organization, with planning, with remembering to pay bills and file taxes and maintain insurance policies. While Ethan chased grand schemes and networking events, I kept our life running behind the scenes. So I'd taken it all on. The mortgage, the car payments, the credit cards, the investment accounts. Everything was transferred to Claire Morrison Donovan, my full legal name. I'd planned to switch it back once his credit recovered, once he proved he could be responsible with our assets again. But then came the late nights. The mysterious phone calls. The business trips that seemed more vacation than work. The excuses that didn't quite add up. I'd suspected for months, maybe longer. The signs were obvious once I stopped making excuses for them. Unexplained charges on credit cards I managed. Hotel stays during supposed client dinners in our own city. New cologne, better grooming, a smugness that hadn't been there before. But Ethan was charming. He always had been. He could explain away anything with that boyish grin and those green eyes that had first caught my attention in college. He could make me feel foolish for questioning him, paranoid for doubting him, cruel for not trusting him during his recovery period. You're being dramatic, Claire, he'd say whenever I brought up inconsistencies. I'm working my ass off to rebuild what we lost. The least you could do is support me instead of interrogating me like I'm some criminal. And I'd back down. Every time. Because I wanted to believe him. Because I was pregnant and exhausted and scared of raising a child alone. Because somewhere deep down, I still remembered the man I'd married, the one who'd promised me forever on a beach in Mexico while tears streamed down both our faces. But the man sitting 3 rows behind me right now, whispering to his mistress during our daughter's funeral service, wasn't that person. Maybe he never had been. The thing about financial control is that it's not just about money. It's about information. When you manage someone's entire financial life, you see everything. Every transaction, every account, every asset and liability. I knew Ethan had been spending money we didn't have on a woman whose existence he denied. I knew he'd been lying about business meetings that were actually dinner dates. I knew he'd been living a double life while I planned nurseries and read pregnancy books and dreamed about the family we were going to build together. What I hadn't known was how brazen he'd become. How little he respected me, our marriage, or even our daughter's memory. Now I did. The service passed in a blur of readings and hymns and condolences I couldn't hear over the roaring in my ears. Through it all, Ethan sat in the back with Marissa, occasionally dabbing at his eyes with a handkerchief while she rubbed his shoulder comfortingly. The performance was masterful. To someone who didn't know better, he looked like a grieving father being supported by a caring friend. But I caught the glances they shared, the intimate way she whispered in his ear, the possessive hand she kept on his thigh. My own mother sat beside me, her face carved from stone, her hand gripping mine so tightly I thought she might break my fingers. She'd seen them too. We all had. "I'm going to kill him," my father muttered from my other side, not bothering to lower his voice. "I'm going to kill them both." "Not here, Dad," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Not today." But inside, part of me wanted to let him do it. Part of me wanted to watch Ethan's carefully constructed image crumble under the weight of public judgment. Part of me wanted to see Marissa's smug expression melt into the horror she deserved to feel. Instead, I focused on getting through the next few hours. The burial would be private, just immediate family. Then the wake at my parents' house, where 40 or 50 people would gather to share memories and comfort each other while consuming casseroles and store-bought cookies. Where Ethan would undoubtedly continue his performance, playing the devastated husband while his mistress played the supportive friend. Where he'd accept condolences and sympathy while calculating how soon he could leave with her. Where I'd have a room full of witnesses for what I was about to do. The burial was a nightmare. Standing beside that impossibly small grave while the priest spoke about eternal peace and God's plan, I felt something inside me crystallize into diamond-hard resolve. Ethan stood across from me, Marissa discreetly positioned behind the gathered family members but still visible. Still there. Still marking her territory even at our daughter's graveside. When it was over, when the last prayer was said and the last handful of dirt thrown, people began making their way to cars for the drive to my parents' house. That's when Marissa made her first mistake. She approached me directly. "Claire," she said, her voice honeysweet with false sympathy. "I'm so sorry for your loss. I know how much this baby meant to you." The words were right, but the delivery was all wrong. There was triumph in her eyes, satisfaction in her smile. She was savoring this moment, relishing her victory over the wife who'd been standing in her way. "Thank you," I said quietly, not trusting myself to say more. "Not yet. I hope you know that Ethan and we want to support you through this difficult time. We're both here for you, whatever you need." "We." She'd said we, as if they were already a unit. As if I was the outsider being graciously included in decisions about my own life. Behind her, Ethan was accepting condolences from his business associates, playing the part of the grieving father with practiced ease. He caught my eye and smiled sadly, the same expression he'd worn when explaining away suspicious charges on our credit cards. "I appreciate that," I told Marissa, my voice steady as stone. "I really do. And I'm looking forward to returning the favor." Something flickered in her eyes, uncertainty replacing smugness for just a moment. But then Ethan was beside her, his hand on the small of her back, and her confidence returned. "Ready to go, sweetheart?" he asked me, the endearment sounding hollow and practiced. "People are waiting at your parents' place." "I'll meet you there," I said. "I need a moment alone with Sophia." They exchanged a look that confirmed everything I'd suspected. Relief that I wasn't coming with them. Anticipation for time alone together. Planning for whatever came next in their carefully orchestrated takeover of my life. "Of course," Ethan said, leaning down to kiss my forehead with the same passion he'd show a distant relative. "Take all the time you need." They walked away together, and I let them go. Because I had learned something important from months of financial management and years of marriage to a liar. Patience is the most powerful weapon in the world. My parents' house was packed when I arrived an hour later. Friends from work, neighbors, relatives from both sides of the family, people from our church. The dining room table groaned under the weight of covered dishes, and coffee percolated in multiple machines throughout the house. This was what support looked like. This was what community meant. People showing up not because they had to, but because they wanted to help carry the weight of grief that was too heavy for one person to bear alone. And then there was Ethan, holding court in the living room with a whiskey in his hand and his arm casually draped around Marissa's shoulders. They weren't even trying to hide it anymore. She was introduced to my high school friends as a close family friend. She was described to my coworkers as someone who's been supporting us through this difficult time. She was presented to distant relatives as practically family already. The audacity was breathtaking. The cruelty was even worse. I watched from the kitchen doorway as Ethan regaled a group of mourners with stories about Sophia, about the nursery we'd painted together, about the plans we'd made for her future. All while his mistress nodded sympathetically beside him, playing the role of the supportive friend who'd been there through it all. My Aunt Margaret approached me, her face tight with barely contained fury. "Claire," she whispered, pulling me aside. "What is that woman doing here? And why is Ethan acting like she belongs?" I looked across the room at my husband, who was now showing Marissa baby photos on his phone while she made appropriately sad faces for his audience. "He's introducing his replacement," I said quietly. "He thinks he's already moved on." "That son of a," Margaret started, but I cut her off with a gentle hand on her arm. "Not yet," I said. "But soon. Because the beautiful thing about community gatherings is that they're public. Whatever happens in a room full of witnesses becomes part of the permanent record. It gets talked about, remembered, shared with people who weren't there to see it firsthand. And I was about to give them something worth remembering. The breaking point came when Ethan decided to make a toast. By that time, he was 3 whiskeys deep and feeling confident. Marissa was tucked against his side like she belonged there, occasionally dabbing at her eyes with tissues while maintaining perfect makeup. He stood up in the middle of my parents' living room, raised his glass, and called for attention. "I want to thank everyone for being here today," he began, his voice carrying that practiced warmth he used in business presentations. "Sophia may not have had the chance to meet all of you, but I know she would have felt the love in this room." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. "So far, so appropriate. Claire and I have been through something no parent should have to endure," he continued, and I noticed he didn't look at me when he said it. "But I've learned that grief has a way of showing you what really matters. Who really matters." His hand tightened on Marissa's shoulder, and she leaned into him with a soft smile. "Life is short," Ethan said, his voice growing stronger. "Too short to waste on regrets or looking backward. Sophia's brief time with us taught me that every day is a gift, and we have to grab hold of happiness whenever we find it." The room was getting uncomfortable now. People were shifting in their seats, exchanging worried glances. Even Marissa was starting to look uncertain about where this toast was heading. "So here's to new beginnings," Ethan concluded, raising his glass higher. "To second chances, to finding love in unexpected places, and to having the courage to choose happiness over obligation." The silence that followed was deafening. No one raised their glass. No one echoed his sentiment. My father looked ready to commit murder, and my mother's face had gone white with shock. That's when I stood up. "Thank you, Ethan," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence. That was illuminating. "I'd like to say something too." Every eye in the room turned to me. 43 people holding their breath, waiting to see how the grieving mother would respond to her husband's toast to new beginnings at their daughter's wake. I smoothed my black dress, the same one I'd worn to our wedding rehearsal dinner 6 years ago, and smiled. "I want to thank everyone for being here today," I began, echoing Ethan's opening. "Your support means more than you'll ever know. Losing Sophia has been devastating, but it's also been educational." I reached into my purse and pulled out a manila envelope. "Grief has a way of clarifying things," I continued, walking to the center of the room where Ethan and Marissa stood frozen. "It strips away illusions and shows you who people really are, who you can count on, and who you can't." Ethan's face had gone pale, but he tried to maintain his composure. "Claire, maybe we should." "For instance," I interrupted gently, "I learned that while I was in the hospital delivering our stillborn daughter 3 days ago, my husband was at the Marriott downtown with his girlfriend. I know this because I manage all our finances, including the credit card he used to pay for the room." Gasps erupted throughout the room. Marissa's face went white, then red, then white again. Ethan looked like he was going to be sick. I also learned that this same girlfriend, Marissa Lane, has been receiving gifts purchased with money from our joint accounts for the past 8 months. Jewelry, clothes, spa treatments, romantic dinners. All while I was preparing for the daughter he claimed to want as much as I did. I opened the envelope and pulled out a stack of papers. But the most educational part of this whole experience has been discovering exactly how much Ethan underestimated me. I said, my voice still calm, still measured. You see, when his business failed 3 years ago, I took over all our finances to protect us from bankruptcy. Everything, the house, the cars, the investment accounts, even his beloved boat, was transferred to my name. The room was so quiet I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. I never transferred anything back, I continued, looking directly at Ethan's horrified face. Which means that legally, Ethan owns nothing. Not even the clothes he's wearing, which were purchased with my credit card. I pulled out another set of papers from the envelope. These are divorce papers, I announced to the room. Filed this morning at 9 a.m., 3 hours before our daughter's funeral. Along with a restraining order that requires Ethan to stay at least 500 yards away from me and any property I own. Which, as I mentioned, is everything he thinks of as his. Marissa made a strangled sound and tried to back away, but the crowd of stunned mourners blocked her escape route. The bank accounts have been frozen pending the divorce proceedings, I continued, my voice never rising above conversational level. The house locks have been changed. His access to any shared assets has been revoked. I turned to face Marissa directly. As for you, dear, I hope your feelings for Ethan are genuine, because he's about to be unemployed, homeless, and penniless. His business connections were mostly mine, and I doubt they'll be eager to work with a man who brought his mistress to his daughter's funeral. The papers in my hand rustled as I folded them carefully and returned them to the envelope. But please, don't let me interrupt your celebration, I said, gesturing toward their abandoned drinks. You were toasting new beginnings, weren't you? Well, congratulations. This is definitely a new beginning for all of us. What happened next was chaos. Ethan started shouting, demanding explanations and apologies and chances to make things right. Marissa burst into tears and fled toward the door, pushing through shocked relatives and friends who parted like the Red Sea. My father and 2 of my uncles physically escorted Ethan from the house when he refused to leave voluntarily. His protests could be heard from the street as they loaded him into his car. My car, technically, and told him to drive away before they called the police. But through it all, I remained calm. I accepted hugs from aunts who whispered good for you in my ears. I answered questions from friends who wanted to know if I was okay, if I needed anything, if there was anything they could do to help. The answer was no. I didn't need anything. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt completely in control of my own life. The revelation had done exactly what I'd hoped it would do. It had turned Ethan from a grieving father into a villain, from a sympathetic figure into someone people would actively avoid. His reputation in our social circle, his standing in our community, his network of business contacts, all of it was destroyed in the span of 10 minutes. More importantly, it had given me the support I needed. Every person in that room now understood exactly who they were dealing with. They'd seen Ethan's true character on full display, witnessed his complete disregard for basic human decency. They'd also seen mine. They'd watched me handle the most devastating betrayal imaginable with grace, intelligence, and strategic precision. I hadn't screamed or cursed or thrown things. I'd simply told the truth and let the consequences unfold naturally. 3 months later, I sat in my newly redecorated living room, coffee growing cold on the table beside me as I read through job offers from companies that had heard about my impressive crisis management skills. The divorce had been finalized in record time. Ethan's lawyer couldn't argue against paperwork that proved I owned everything he'd been claiming as his. The restraining order remained in place after he'd violated it twice, showing up drunk at my office and my parents' house demanding his fair share of assets that had never legally belonged to him. Marissa had lasted exactly 6 weeks after discovering that her sugar daddy was actually broke and unemployed. According to mutual acquaintances, she'd moved on to a real estate developer from the suburbs and was already planning her next upgrade. The house felt different now. Bigger somehow, despite being exactly the same size. The silence wasn't oppressive anymore. It was peaceful. I'd removed all traces of Ethan's presence, donated his belongings to charity, and slowly began the process of rebuilding my life from the ground up. The only thing I'd kept was Sophia's nursery. I couldn't bear to dismantle it yet, couldn't face packing away the tiny clothes and unused toys and dreams that had died with her. But I'd made it beautiful, filled it with flowers and photographs and the rocking chair where I sometimes sat to remember what love was supposed to feel like. My phone rang, breaking through my reverie. The caller ID showed my sister's name. "Hey, I answered, settling back into the couch. "Claire, you need to see this," she said without preamble. "I'm sending you a link right now." My phone buzzed with a text message containing a Facebook URL. I clicked on it and found myself looking at Ethan's profile, which he apparently hadn't bothered to make private. The most recent post was a photo of him sitting alone at a bar, looking disheveled and significantly thinner than when I'd last seen him. The caption read, "When you lose everything that matters, you find out what you're really made of. Some people can't handle the truth about themselves." The comments section was brutal. Mutual friends and former business associates had replied with variations of "you brought this on yourself and maybe don't cheat on your wife while she's burying your child." Even his own family members had weighed in, expressing shame and disappointment in language that was decidedly unforgiving. "He's been posting stuff like this for weeks," Emma explained while I scrolled through increasingly desperate status updates. "Poor me posts about how he's been wronged, how people don't understand his side of the story. It's actually kind of pathetic." I closed the app and set my phone aside. I felt nothing looking at those posts. No satisfaction, no pity, no lingering anger. Ethan had become irrelevant to my life so completely that even his attempts to garner sympathy couldn't touch me. "Claire." Emma's voice called through the speaker. "You still there?" "I'm here," I said. "Just thinking." "About what?" I looked around my peaceful living room, at the life I was building for myself brick by brick. At the job offers spread across my coffee table, each one representing a new opportunity to use my skills in ways that would challenge and fulfill me. At the future that stretched ahead, uncertain but entirely mine to shape. "About how quiet revenge really is the sweetest kind," I said finally. "He destroyed himself. I just refused to clean up the mess." 6 months after Sophia's funeral, I accepted a position as Chief Financial Officer for a non-profit organization that helped women escape abusive relationships. The irony wasn't lost on me, using the financial skills I developed while married to help other women break free from men who controlled and manipulated them. On my first day, I wore a red dress. Not black, not gray, not the muted colors I'd favored during my marriage. Red, bright and bold and unapologetic. The woman who walked into that office building was not the same person who'd sat frozen in a church pew 6 months earlier. That woman had been broken, devastated, clinging to the wreckage of a marriage that had never been real. This woman was something different. Stronger, smarter, more ruthlessly honest about what she would and wouldn't accept in her life. She'd been forged in the fire of the worst betrayal imaginable and emerged not bitter, but precise. Not angry, but strategic. She'd learned that the loudest vengeance isn't always the most effective. That sometimes the most devastating response to cruelty is simply to stop enabling it. To step back and let natural consequences unfold without interference or protection. My husband had brought his mistress to our daughter's funeral, thinking he was asserting dominance. Instead, he'd handed me the keys to his complete destruction. And I'd used them quietly, efficiently, permanently. The best part? I hadn't had to lift a finger beyond telling the truth. Everything that happened to Ethan after that wake was the direct result of choices he'd made, consequences he'd earned, a reputation he'd built through his own actions. I didn't destroy him at our daughter's funeral. He destroyed himself. I just refused to save him from drowning. And for the first time in years, I was completely at peace with that decision. As I settled into my new office that morning, arranging family photos on my desk and reviewing the day's schedule, my phone chimed with a text from an unknown number. "I hope you're happy now," it read. "You've ruined everything good in my life." I recognized the self-pitying tone immediately. Ethan, texting from yet another new number after I'd blocked the previous ones. I stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. Because the truth was, I was happy. Not because I'd ruined his life, I hadn't, but because I'd finally learned to value my own. And that, I thought as I turned my attention to the stack of case files waiting on my desk, was a lesson worth learning, no matter how much it cost to acquire it. The first case file belonged to a woman whose husband had been financially abusing her for years, keeping her isolated and dependent by controlling every aspect of their finances. Reading her story, I felt a familiar spark of recognition and determination. Some battles, I'd learned, are worth fighting. Not for revenge, not for spite, but for justice. For the simple principle that actions should have consequences, and that people who abuse power should face the natural results of their choices. I picked up my red pen and got to work.